My name's Giles Newman. I'm Head of Merchant Services for CHIC. Today, the webinar, we shall be discussing the new smoke and CO alarm regulations. Our speakers today, we have Paul Cartwright, who's the Head of National Accounts for ACO, who will be discussing what do the new regulations say. We've got Catherine Saunders and Meadow O'Connor, solicitor from Trowers and Hamlins, who will be going through the legal implications for landlords. Darren Stanforth, who's the Head of Technical Solutions for CEF, who will run through a guide to electrical safety. It will then come back to me for what's next, and then we'll do Q&As towards the end. Should anybody at all have any questions that they would specifically like answered, if you can please put them into the chat box. We'll pick those up as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we possibly can towards the end. So with no further ado, I shall hand you over to Paul.
Bang on time, Giles, well done. I'll just try and get my presentation up as quickly as possible. So I am on a timer with Manjit. So can everyone see that okay? Give me a thumbs up, Manjit, if it's there. Perfect. Right. Well, yeah, as Giles mentioned, I'm Head of National Accounts for ACO. We've given this presentation a couple of times, and we discussed holding this webinar to get the message out to as many people as possible. So I'll jump straight in. We are swamped by legislation and standards in England and the UK. We've got a lot of different standards, and some of them are falling well out of date now as well. So it's not before time that we are seeing some updates to these standards and legislation. So the current situation, a lot of residential landlords, social landlords have been basically working to the British standard, which is effectively asking for grade D1 system, which is mains powered with rechargeable cells, and LD2, which is effectively the amount of coverage what's in the property, so hallway, landing, and high risk rooms, i.e. kitchen and living room, all interconnected, and as I mentioned, tamper-proof non-replaceable batteries are required within this. That's prescriptive guidance, what's been out there for a number of years, the most recent one being 2019. For carbon monoxide, there's a similar British standard, BSEM 50292. Not as many organisations, not as many landlords tend to follow this as strictly as they do the 5839, the smoke alarm standard. If they did, it would mean more or less a CO alarm in nearly all the rooms in the property, in every room with a fuel burning appliance, where occupants spend most of the time, and where they wouldn't be able to wear the CO alarm, as well as any room where a flue might pass through as well. So generally speaking, the requirements within the 50292 tend to push people to install a lot of CO alarms if they're following that standard. Approved document J has ensured that any solid fuel burning appliance going into a new build property or being installed from scratch received a CO alarm, but it was only solid fuel burning appliances. This has been around since 2015, the private rental legislation. Mandatory requirements for private landlords to ensure they do have a working smoke alarm on every floor of the property, as well as requiring a working CO alarm where they had a solid fuel burning appliance. And that's been fairly successful in getting the standards to a point, at least anyway. And then we've got the Homes Act. The first real key iteration will push for smoke alarms of 2004, requiring a property what was fit for human habitation effectively, and that's been now extended with the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018, which again reiterates the requirement for a safe and reasonable living accommodation for residents. A number of risks on there, including fire and CO, but they do go on to damp, mould, ventilation, excess cold and heat, trips and falls, various other things, but should be mitigated by a responsible landlord. So now we go on to the consultation, which is big part of why we're here today, I suppose. So on 17th September, consultation was launched, looking for views on extending the existing private landlords legislation effectively from 2015 to include extra coverage into social properties and covering all fuel burning appliances. The proposed changes would also extend to approved document J, and it would be published alongside the social housing white paper. That was back in September 2020. The consultation had 161 responses from across the sector, so residents, housing charities, local authorities, fire and rescue. Everyone had the opportunity to comment on this, and like I said, for such a far-reaching, wide sort of scope legislation, 161 responses seemed a little bit low to me, but that's what we received. Unfortunately, the majority of responses were in favour of most of the questions asked within the consultation. So they were in favour of extending the existing legislation to social housing, the landlord being responsible for repairing or replacing any alarms that went faulty, extending those requirements for CO alarms to cover all fuel burning appliances, ensuring the residents should be responsible for testing the alarms, and the majority of responses were in favour of the changes commencing as soon as possible. Now, the key date there is the 23rd of November 2021. What's been stated in documents is that was the date effectively where social landlords were given notice of the upcoming legislation. So 23rd November 2021, effectively, social landlords were informed that these changes would commence as soon as possible. We're not entirely convinced that was the case because it weren't widely published, but that's the date what people are working to. So since then, Eddie Hughes, the MP, has written out to social housing providers and basically asked them to move more quickly, I suppose, in terms of installing smoke alarms. Strongly encourage you to begin installing the alarms as this legislation is coming. It's still not gone through its second reading at Parliament, so there were still question marks as to whether or not it would go ahead, but everyone was expecting it to. So the letter went out basically saying, look, you really need to start doing this, and any breaches could end with a fine of up to £5,000. We then got another letter on the 11th of May, effectively saying the second reading was going to be laid in draft before Parliament, and if everything was approved, it would come into force on the 1st of October. So quite a few communications going out since the actual consultation and the responses. So this is effectively where we're at. Requirements are for smoke alarms to be installed on every floor in a property, and the recommendation is to follow BS 5839 Part 6 2019. So interlinking mains powered alarms would be the recommendation, even though that's not the minimum standard. Carbon monoxide alarms should be fitted wherever there is a fuel burning appliance in the property, with the exception of cooking appliances. Updated the requirements to approved document J, so CO alarms will be installed with any fuel burning appliance now under building regs. And the changes will come into effect on the 1st of October. That's all been confirmed on the government website now. And the key part of this was there will be no grace period for compliance. Now we're 11 days away from that. So this, if any of you attending today, this is the first you're hearing about it, then you've got 11 days basically to meet this requirement. A few other things: it will be the landlord's responsibility to install and maintain the alarms. It will remain the tenant's responsibility to test their alarms. The recommended time is monthly. Landlords should consider, where they are instructing the tenants, that they should be testing the alarms, that they have got the facility to test those alarms. In a lot of cases, they might not be able to reach the ceiling, and you might be asking them to put themselves at risk. By testing the alarms, there are options available to mitigate that risk. They can use either battery-powered or mains-powered CO alarms, and there's no requirement within this legislation to interlink the alarms themselves. We would still strongly recommend that all the alarms are interlinked. The Welsh have gone slightly left field of basically the England and Wales legislation, so they won't be following the England and Wales legislation because they've introduced their own, and from the 1st of December they're basically introducing the fitness for human habitation guidance for landlords. and it places the same obligations on the landlords to make sure that properties fit for human habitation. Part of that is for fire and CO safety. So there are a number of other things in there in terms of risk, similar to the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act. The requirements for smoke and CO is, again, working smoke alarm on every property. Those smoke alarms should be mains powered and they should be interconnected. That's gone into more detail than what the English one has. The manufacturer's replacement date should be noted for data purposes and obviously for replacement purposes. And another big difference is the CO alarms should be installed in any part of the property with any fuel burned appliance. There is no exception for cookers in Wales. It's all fuel burned appliances.
Paul, sorry, just to interrupt, you've got about 4 minutes left.
Even better. I'm doing better than I thought, to be honest. I thought you were going to say I've got 1 minute left. So the timeline, effectively, it looks like this. Back in 1990, we didn't have anything. Really, asking people to fit smoke alarms or CO alarms, and as you can see, that whole period there were no regulations for carbon monoxide at all. In 92, we did see Approved Document B introduced, which basically ensured that they were working mains alarms. It was mains only back in the day, which is odd, really, when you consider that if the power goes off, people would start doing things what will put them more at risk from having a fire in the property, lighting candles, turning the cooker on, and various other things. So that did change over time, but right back in the day, it was minimum mains only smoke alarms in new build properties. In 95, we got 5839 Part 6, but you will notice in most cases you'll see the Scottish and the Northern Irish flag well in advance of the UK standards, basically. And again, through the years, you'll see a lot more Scotland flags where the standards have basically been updated and upgraded, technical standards in Scotland, and then we got the prescriptive guidance, BS 5839, again updated in 2004. The repairing standard in Scotland was quite a significant one back in 2006 as well. And then you'll see effectively 2012 Technical Booklet E introduced minimum standard of LD2 in Northern Ireland. The building standards in 2010 for Scotland, again LD2. 5839 Part 6 in UK, effectively still asking for minimum standards of hallway and landing. And then the repairing standard push that again into the private sector. And then we had the unfortunate incident of Grenfell tragedy, effectively, which did drive a lot more sort of fire safety in dwellings, a lot more focus on this moving forward in England and Wales. The Fitness for Human Habitation Act was introduced in 2018. In Scotland in 2019, the tolerable standard effectively and basically made a mandatory act for all properties in Scotland to meet that minimum standard, having a smoke alarm and heat alarm in the property, covering all the risk rooms, so hallway and landing, kitchen and living room as minimum, interlinked, and a CO alarm in every room with an appliance. So basically, if you live in Scotland, you're extremely safe from fire and CO. England have yet to catch up on that. Basically, what we're looking at now is England and the private sector, basically all the private rental sector being pushed to fit smoke and CO alarms, but in people and owner occupiers in their own home don't need to still. Over time, we're hoping that we will be catching up with Scotland. I think I'm more or less bang on time, Manjit, so I'll hand back to Giles and let you carry on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Most appreciated. A lot of information there, and we've had some questions come through, so we'll be asking those towards the end. I'm going to hand over to Charles and Hamlet. So, Meadow and Catherine, good morning.
Apologies, sorry, there's a bit of a delay there. Hi, I'm Katie Saunders, and I'm partner at Charles Hamlin's. Thanks for the introduction earlier. So I specialise in sort of construction and procurement advice and compliance obligations, and Meadow O'Connor is a solicitor on our team, specialising more in the health and safety compliance and property litigation for social landlords. So the purpose of us being on this presentation is obviously to give the sort of the legislative background, but to be fair, Paul has given a very good background already to some of that legislation and regulation. I'm just going to set it in context, and Meadow's going to go into a bit more of the detail. So as Paul has already outlined, this is part of the package of reforms arising out of the focus on building safety, connected to, but also, to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, sadly. But the original regulations were in place for private sector landlords from 2015. So the private sector have been doing this already. And to be fair, everyone thought the public sector were much better at this than the private sector, hence where the regulations came in 2015 to pick up on these requirements. But of course, as Paul has outlined, consultation linked to social housing reforms has picked up that this is a requirement that we should be focusing as well for the social housing sector, and consequently the requirements that come in to play from October this year. As I said, backdrop is this package of general building safety reform, which of course a lot of social landlords, all our social landlords clients are getting to grips with, but a lot of them are asking us, what are the consequences if we don't? And we will be covering that, as well as the detail of what the requirements are. The regulator is due to publish some guidance, as in the social housing regulator. We're expecting that sort of any time now as to what compliance is going to mean, whether that's 100% compliance, which of course most social landlords will want to achieve before they have to report to the regulator in March, or what the variation on that is. There was a feeling, and I think in the consultation, that 95% of social landlords were compliant already, but there is obviously that concern that there is a 5% gap, and some, that's obviously some landlords are more compliant than others. So we will be covering, that, but at the moment we don't have the guidance from the regulator. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Meadow, who's going to share our slides and go through the detailed legislation. I'll pick up any questions at the end.
Thanks, Katie. So hopefully our slides are visible for you. Appreciate a quick thumbs up if that's the case. Yeah, hopefully our slides are there. Grand. So as Katie's just spoken through as the background, and Paul has obviously helpfully given an incredibly comprehensive view on the kind of the legislation. What I kind of wanted to touch on again is kind of these core obligations that, don't go into quite the level of detail and specifics as Paul has done on his presentation. But ultimately, we need to have one smoke alarm on each storey of the property where there is a room that's being used as living accommodation. There needs to be a carbon monoxide alarm in any room that is used as living accommodation, which contains a fixed combustion appliance. That, of course, excludes gas cookers, because there is a separate regime for gas safety, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And landlords need to repair or replace smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms once they've been informed by the tenant that the alarm is faulty, or there could be an issue with those alarms. The legislation does define living accommodation as a room where the primary purpose of that is living, or it's a room where a person spends a significant amount of time. And a fixed combustion device is fixed apparatus where fuel of any type is burned to generate heat. So these regulations will apply to all homes that are rented by private landlords, but also to registered providers of social housing. There are some exclusions, which I've listed on the slide here, which are student halls of residence, long leases, hotels, refuges, care homes, hospitals, hospices, accommodation where there's a live-in landlord, and some other kind of minor exceptions. As has previously been stated, these regulations come into force on the 1st of October, 11 days away, as Paul has kind of helpfully pointed out. And there is no transitional period. Landlords are obliged to be compliant at this date. There is no grace period, there's no phasing in period for this legislation. So one question that we're seeing a lot is kind of, you know, what can we do to be prepared? And I mean, that certainly depends on how many properties we're talking about, or how many, you know, what your relationship is with your tenant. Obviously, for registered providers of social housing, that's going to be you might have a significant amount of housing stock, and that will be a much bigger obligation than perhaps if you have, you know, 10 privately rented properties, in which case you should of course be compliant already. But ultimately, as Katie mentioned, the National Housing Federation advises that 95% of social housing landlords report compliance already. You may or may not agree with that, but a lot of landlords will be confident that they are already compliant with this legislation, given that the 2015 regulations meant that this was already on people's radar. Ultimately, if a landlord isn't sure whether they comply, the only way to completely satisfy yourself of that is to gain access to your tenanted properties, to inspect the alarms and to check that they are compliant. And if you discover that they aren't, to install new or additional smoke and carbon monoxide alarms to that property. I mean, usually tenants will welcome this. Obviously, it's in their interest to permit access. But in the rare occasion that it's difficult to obtain access, then landlords need to exercise powers pursuant to tenancies in a similar way as they may do for gas safety inspections. And that would be ultimately through an injunction if it's not possible to obtain access through liaising and corresponding with the tenants. Obviously, the key priority is to ensure that these properties are safe and meet the standards that are recognised as being safe and as being acceptable. So the other point to consider is going forward, if you're looking to acquire new stock or you're purchasing new properties, that you need to check as part of your due diligence at the outset of that purchase that that stock is compliant with this legislation, to save you inheriting problems that might rear their heads later down the line. Now, as Katie mentioned at the start, Trowers and Hanlon's is on the legal advisors panel to the Regulator of Social Housing. So where these sort of questions come up, we are able to get a view from the regulator, because I'm aware that a lot of landlords, particularly obviously social housing landlords, are aware that there is no transitional period here. We're a little bit worried about whether or not we're going to be compliant on 1st of October, or we might have this concern that we aren't going to be compliant, and what do we need to do about that? Now, the regulator has said that they will be adopting a pragmatic approach. So the regulator is not expecting social housing landlords to be flying the flag on 1st of October and saying, hang on, we don't know whether we're compliant, or we're worried that we're not compliant, so we want to self-refer to protect our position, or to make sure that they're erring on the side of caution. The regulator has said that they will be pragmatic. They're not expecting registered providers to be self-referring on 1st of October. And as Katie said, that they will be producing some guidance. But what the regulator has said so far is that the most important step is having an action plan for ensuring and reaching compliance within a reasonable time. Now, what is a reasonable time? That's what we're hoping the guidance will cover. But ultimately, the onus is on landlords to be fully aware of their position, and that might be that currently they're not compliant, but having an agreed programme to ensure compliance within a reasonable period, to be able to demonstrate that they are working towards that compliance. There is a distinction between registered providers who are aware of the problem and have a plan on how to fix it, i.e. they're aware of areas of non-compliance and are working towards fixing that, and registered providers that are unable to do that. So I think the general message from the regulator is work towards compliance, and be able to demonstrate that you are doing that going forward.
Meadow, sorry to interrupt, you've got about a minute left. That's okay.
No problem, thanks Manjit. And Paul obviously touched on this. The local authority is the enforcement body in terms of actual compliance with these regulations, and the sanction ultimately is a remediation notice and a fine of up to £5,000 for non-compliance that would be enforceable through the courts. Thank you very much. I think Casey might just close us off.
Yeah, no, I'm not, and I see there's a question which I think we're going to deal with at the end in terms of, in a sense, the way that these regulations can be treated in terms of the context of whether it's going to be similar to gas compliance as well. So we'll pick that up probably at the end when we've run through everyone else's presentations. Hand you back to Giles now.
Lovely. Thank you very much, ladies. Most appreciated.
Thank you.
And yes, as you mentioned, there is a question that's come through, so we'll pick that up towards the end. So I'm going to hand over to Darren. Good morning, Darren.
Morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today to talk about electrical safety, which isn't the most exciting thing to do first thing in the morning, but I'll give it my best shot with you here. It's vitally important that you understand where you are with regards to electrical safety, because there is a change to British standards about to happen. Currently, the electrical installation work being carried out there can be done to two standards, to the blue and to the new brown. However, that is about to change. As of Tuesday next week, it is the 27th, there's a change to the way that we work in the UK. This is a first to the electrical industry. In the past, you've always been able to work to previous documents. As long as design was done to that previous version, you could carry on doing the installation and the commissioning after the transfer deadline, effectively. But now what they're saying is they've introduced one word. The word now is a withdrawn standard. And this is typical of British standards that we're seeing across the UK. And what it basically means is, although, yes, a blue copy is available, that is a withdrawn standard. You can no longer work to it, which means you must get your head around everything that is going to be in the brown book. So it's brown all the way from here. So that means to you guys, you really need to have a look to make sure that any new work being done as of the 28th of September is fully compliant with the brown BS 7671. It's no longer acceptable to say, well, this job that I'm about to finish was designed to a previous version. You can't work like that anymore. It's quite clear that it's been inserted in there for a reason. And the reason that British Standards and the IET, who put the regulations together, the reason they put this word withdrawn in there was clear. It's because they wanted to stop people and designers of systems, installers of systems, taking previous standards over and past the deadline. So let's remember, on the 27th of September, you can continue to work to two versions. As of the 28th, when you turn up to work on the 28th, the installation work that you're doing then must comply with the new brown. Now, that may mean that you've started a job on the Monday to the blue, you turn up on Tuesday, you've got to scrap what you've done and you've got to start to implement the new standards as they are written in the brown. That's a big bit about what we're going to have to try and get our head around now. So compliance wise, you really need to get your head around what's in the contract between you and the subcontractor. If it says in the subcontractor that your work must be in line with the current version of BS 7671, then that's it, brown book. That's the one they're going to have to go to. That's correct. They should be doing that. However, if your contracts clearly state a date to the document that you want them to install to, so for instance, the blue book that we see here is dated 2018, it's this date here that your contracts need to be changed, because this has been withdrawn. It doesn't exist anymore. So you can't really refer to it for any binding information. It needs to be in line with the new standard. What does it effectively mean to you? Well, if you're looking at high-rise buildings, so in the definitions of the standard here, it's a building 6 meters or above. If you've got any of those in your portfolio, you really need to look at any new installation work for socket outlets. What does this mean? So any socket outlet or any circuit supplying the socket outlets, if any work was done on that circuit, adding a new one, moving one maybe, then this would require a new device known as an arc fault detection device. These have been around for a while. However, they've only become mandatory in those high-rise buildings as of the 28th of September, next Tuesday. So next Tuesday, if any work's done in those, and it is on the circuits, final circuit supplying the socket outlets, you're going to have to look for the AFDD. Now, these are adding additional expenses to the installation. However, the merits in installing these are enormous. They really will help you ensure that the users of the installation are safer. What does it do? An arc fault detection device? Well, it looks for any arc that is happening on the final circuit, so the cables to the socket outlets, but it also will protect anything that's plugged into that socket outlet, such as the final appliance. So it could be hair straighteners, it could be a fridge freezer, it could be a lawnmower, anything of that's going to be plugged in. It will look to detect a fault in there, or the cable in, or the cable into the socket outlet. If there is a fault in there, they should be switching themselves off. Again, we've heard Grenfell mentioned this morning, this introduction has been directly included because of those horrific events that happened at Grenfell. We know full well that there are great merits in installing these, and our colleagues across the mainland continental Europe have installed these for many years. So we're starting to see them be introduced here now. So any new work that's going to be on those final circuits supplying those socket outlets, again, must have these devices. Another thing that we do heavily in the social rented sector, we carry out electrical installation condition reports. Now, one change we're seeing in this new standard is the type of RCDs that we install in our installations. Now, the RCDs, we've been installing them for years and they've been in the specifications for an awful long time. However, it's the type of RCD that we're coming across now that is a concern. Because of the world we live in nowadays, we go plugging a lot of devices in that work on DC. So this is the DC current that there is vital to these devices working. We know full well, however, that DC can be detrimental to a number of RCDs. So the RCDs that we've been installing for years are typically a type AC type RCD. They work quite healthily and quite perfectly in an AC environment, an alternating current. So this is the alternating current that we're used to seeing and used to supplying all the energy in our homes and properties that we work in as well. The equipment, however, is DC. So here we get some loggerhead, we get some battle between how the appliance changes it from AC into DC. That DC has the ability to leak back onto the AC side of things. And when it does so, it can compromise those RCDs that are in there to provide life safety critical devices, which is what an RCD is. So much so that the regulations now recognize this, and they tell us that we should only make sure that there is a type A RCD. So when you're carrying out EICRs, or you're installing new RCDs, they must be of a type A device. And on an EICR, electrical installation condition report, if you're identifying that there are existing old type AC devices, you've got to change it up a little bit, because you've got to look to ensure that there are those type A references throughout your EICR reports. So the reports you may want to put on there, it may be what's known as a C3 outcome, requires improvement. However, if there was clear evidence there that there was going to be problems with the DC, because there's lots of computers, there may be lots of low voltage, extra low voltage downlights, This may be a concern to you, so you may elevate that from a C3, requires improvement, to a C2, which basically means something's got to be done. You've got to actually physically replace that RCD that is there. So we've looked at AFDDs and we've looked at RCDs as well. The other change that we're seeing here is the regulations are quite clear on surge protection devices now. Surge protection devices, there was an argument to say you could do what's known as the risk assessment, and through the risk assessment, you could determine whether an SPD was needed. An SPD, a surge protection device, will protect the electrical installation and the appliances from over voltage, where we see spikes in the voltage because of voltage frequencies, and they change because of the loads that are happening in around us. If we switch a large load off, such as in a block of flats, if we were to switch off the motor that's running up that cable car, that lift, then at that point there, it can create a large load. Now that will create a spike in the circuit that can damage some of the circuitry that's out there. So SPDs have been installed. One of the critical parts is the regulations now confirm that where there is a safety service installed, that these devices must be installed. So earlier on, we were talking about those smoke detectors and those CO detectors. This may mean that you've got to really look to protect those against the overvoltage implications, because overvoltage will be a problem to these, and Paul and his team know that, so they're building everything they can. But this is for you guys designing electrical systems to ensure that there is, at the front end of the installation, there is going to be that protection there that's needed. Also, the regulations with regard to AFDDs, as well as I mentioned that they are going to be required for those high-rise properties, they are also going to be required in care homes or anything that's under the Care Quality Commission. Also, they're looking for multiple occupancy, so homes of multiple occupancy, HMOs, licensed properties with the local authorities. Those will also require the additional protection of the arc fault detection devices. So
just a heads up, you've got 2 minutes left.
That's pretty, thank you very much. So there are some really big important changes that you're going to have to get your head around. Now, in my last 2 minutes, what I probably will do is I'll say, look, there's far too much going on, but it's really important that if you are registered with NIC, EIC, you're registered with ECA, or you're registered with NAPIT as an organisation, you're required to complete a certain amount of CPD now. That CPD is 30 hours for your installers, your electricians, your designers, 30 hours a year. What we're doing here at CEF, we're making that some of that CPD available to you free of charge. And Atul, who's been with us all the way through this journey, he's going to be available again for you to come to us and say, yeah, we need some CPD. What we can do then, we can take you through the transition between this document and the Brown and how it's going to affect you and what you've got to stop and what you've got to start doing. So please feel free to contact us and we can make sure that any of your CPD needs can be met. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Darren, most appreciated. So what are the next steps? We're going to come up with some questions very soon, some questions and answers, because we've had quite a few that have come through. So Manjit's going to pick those up on everybody's behalf. Just the next steps with regards to CHIC, should you require any of these services, whether it's a labour service or whether it's a material service for any of these products that have been discussed today, please get in contact with CHIC. We do have numerous frameworks and also DPSs, especially for materials for merchants, so we'll be able to pick up and work with ACO. So should you have any of those requirements, please get in contact. Manjit, I'm conscious we've got some questions, only 20 minutes left. I'm going to hand over to you for Q&A.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Thanks very much to all the speakers. So we'll just move on to some of the questions. We've had a question for you, Paul, so you'll be able to help this one. Paul, you've said you recommend a CO and fire alarm should be interlinked. There should be an assessment on whether the interlink is suitable in a specific property, as sometimes it's not suitable. Does ACO have any information on how to assess suitability?
Yeah, thanks, Manjit. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I thought we could rely on you to ask a few questions. There isn't any specific guidance on where and how to assess on interlinking the smoke and CO alarms. Our concern, and the reason what we'll always promote interlinking the alarms, is audibility through the property. The principle being, if a CO alarm site is in a remote room where the boiler is, for example, the boiler could be set to come on at 7 AM in the morning while people are still in bed. If they're in bed and asleep and they can't hear the CO alarm in a remote room, then potentially the CO, if there is an issue, the CO could migrate through the property and find them in the bedroom before they're even aware there's an issue. That's effectively the reason for using the smoke alarms linked through the property. So if you've got a smoke alarm on the upstairs landing, for example, connected to the one downstairs, connected to the one in the kitchen, and the CO alarm's in the utility room at the back of the house, then effectively you'll get that audibility throughout the house if there's an issue. We always recommend, ideally, that there's some form of identification. So CO alarms do sound differently to smoke alarms, but when you've got an interlinked system, you will have your smoke alarms activating as well. We do have the facility within our systems that if they're linked together by RF, for example, all the smoke alarms sound like a CO. We do have a control switch on the wall, which basically will identify whether it's CO or smoke what's activated the system. But in terms of specific guidance, it's just a case of looking at if there's any kind of audibility potential issue within that property where the CO alarm's cited, then look at linking it to other CO alarms if they're in the property, or use the smoke alarms as that additional audibility throughout the property.
Great, thank you, Paul. Katie and Meadow, I think this one's directed at yourselves. So is there any concern that judges will not treat this as seriously as gas compliance? Any concerns regarding the awarding of injunctions by a judge?
I'm happy to take this one, Katie, if that's all right, just on the basis that, gas safety injunctions is something that we deal with, I wouldn't quite say on a daily basis, but certainly a weekly basis. Generally speaking, in the context of building safety and the fact that landlords are trying their very best, as evidenced by the fact that they're trying to get into this property to ensure the safety and the compliance of the alarms that are fitted within it, the judiciary, in our experience of gas safety, are extremely sympathetic and understanding to landlords that are trying to ultimately ensure that their property is safe and that they're complying with legislation. So in the context of gas safety, we've certainly seen that, generally speaking, the judiciary aren't cautious about awarding injunctions where one is should rightly be granted. And obviously we don't have any kind of evidence on this basis at the moment, but in the context of building safety, where a landlord is certainly trying to do their very best to comply with legislation, particularly where building safety is very much in the news and is very much a sensitive area for a lot of people, we would expect that the judiciary will take this just as seriously as gas safety. We would expect that a very similar approach would be applied by the judiciary, and we would expect that landlords would be expected to take a similar approach as they do to gas safety, because it is just as serious, and it's just that landlords need to now get into the habit of doing these checks as they do their gas safety checks. And we would expect the judiciary and tenants to treat it just as similarly with a similar degree of seriousness and respect as gas safety inspections. So I don't have any concerns. Obviously we need to wait and see a little bit, but I would expect the judiciary to treat it with just the same approach as with gas safety, and show kind of sympathy to landlords that are trying to comply with their building safety obligations and legislation.
And just to add to that, I think one of the things where you can demonstrate that you're obviously taking this seriously yourself as a landlord is to have robust contracts in place and have some, so just with gas safety compliances, you have a long-term arrangement with your gas safety service provider, demonstrate you've got standards that you're working towards, how you contract legally on those things is important as well. So again, not obviously applying an ad hoc approach, it's obviously got to be taken seriously with a robust formal contract in place with your service provider.
Lovely, thank you both. We've had another question come through. This one's a little bit long, so just bear with me whilst I read it out. The amended legislation sets out minimum requirements for the alarms, but installing alarms to be compliant with the legislation does not mean the alarms will work or be suitable for the property. For example, alarms installed in the incorrect locations. Is there an industry guide or stakeholders are working to agree to utilise? Paul mentioned BS-EN 50292. Would this be the recommended guidance to be used?
Thanks again, Dan. Yes, effectively, from our perspective and the signposts, what has been seen on the legislation is to follow the appropriate standards. So always our guidance will be to follow the standards. We make people aware of the minimum requirements under legislation, but we'll always guide people to the prescriptive guidance what's there. So for smoke alarms, 5839 part 6, and for CO 50292, and it will push you towards basically installing a more appropriate system for the type of property. And in most cases, particularly within fire, design should be based upon risk assessments, where you're a large landlord with multiple thousands of properties. That's not always going to be the case and not always going to be practicable to do, hence following the sort of minimum requirements within the British standards. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks Paul. We'll move on to the next one. We've had one come in. So this person says currently they're buying a second floor flat in a building approximately 2005. Will AFDD requirements apply?
No, they won't. AFDDs are for new work, so the standards as they exist, the installation work at the time it was done needed to comply. They're not retrospectively applied, so we just need to make sure that your installation, the one that you're buying, was right at the day that it was actually installed. So the fact that it's a 2015 flat, these legislations have only come, or these standards have only come in now. So no, they're not required.
Lovely, thank you, Darren. I'll move on to the next one. Is there a requirement for a visual alarm to be used in conjunction with the audio alarm for smoke and heat detectors?
That effectively comes back down to the resident. If it's, if a resident's been identified that they need a visual device because they won't necessarily be able to hear the alarms due to any physical impairments, then yes. If you're looking at some very low rise buildings where you might be covering communal areas and multiple people could be in there, and you're not necessarily sure who's going to be entering and exiting the building, then generally speaking, you need to accommodate all physical attributes effectively. So having a visible strobe there as well would help. But within individual dwellings, you don't need to cater for everyone with a visual device, unless you do identify someone within that property who needs it.
Thank you, Paul. Another one, is there a legal requirement to enforce these new standards on leaseholders with a mixed tenure block?
I'll leave that one to Meadow, I think.
Thanks, Paul. So not entirely sure on the context of this question. I should say we're happy to kind of follow up afterwards if that would help, but presumably you mean long leaseholders within a property that's multi-let property. So the legislation doesn't apply to long leasehold. So you see these particularly in respect to flats, leasehold for 125 years, 999-year leases. They are within the exclusions from this legislation, but I think ultimately landlords should be making their property and wanting to make their property as safe as possible, and that would mean checking relevant standards and ensuring that their properties comply. Landlords should be aware of their obligations within the lease, whether that's a long lease, a short lease, or a tenancy, in terms of whether they have an obligation to ensure that the property is safe, whether they have an obligation to ensure that the property is compliant with all relevant laws and regulations. Landlords may also wish to consider, in the context of their insurance, whether having substandard or perhaps alarms that comply with an older standard, whether that might affect their insurance, and generally their position under the lease. What we would usually recommend is that if a landlord isn't sure or has a concern, then they should look to check their lease and to check the equipment that is installed at any property. But I think generally the overarching thing should be, wanting to make sure that that property is as safe as possible. You may not need to inspect. You could have a quick word with your leaseholder, see whether they are able to perhaps send some pictures of the alarm to indicate where that is, and that can start a conversation with you then saying as landlord, well, actually there's this new legislation that's coming out. We want to ensure that your property is safe. Is there a good time for us to pop around and take a look? A lot of the time that will be all that it needs, just to make sure that you are comfortable with that. The other thing that I just wanted to pick up on in this question is the wording, enforce new standards. And I'm just thinking, presumably you mean whether we need to bring that into, whether we need to consider this legislation in that context. And I would just say generally, as a landlord, you should want to have a property that is as safe as possible. So we would always recommend that you look to that legislation as a minimum standard, and look to enforce or kind of incorporate that into your properties. Do you have anything to add, Katie?
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, you can't go marching into leaseholder homes saying you need to change your smoke alarm. Essentially, that's this legislation didn't give you the power to do that. But of course, as Meadow was saying, it's that softer approach of explaining that this is a requirement, and we want to make sure the whole property is safe. And trying to do it that way rather than working with leasehold groups, etc., and stuff like that might then themselves obviously take action on their own behalf. But I think as we see more of this happening and changes, and maybe some work's being carried out into the tenanted properties within that block, there'll be naturally queries from the leaseholders as to, or what about our properties? And what are you doing something for us? Should you be doing that? And is that under the terms of your repairing obligations as landlord? Possibly not, because it's not going to be, it's within the inside of the property rather than the external structure and outside, which is normally covered by the landlord's obligation. So I think it's start that conversation as a soft approach first, and see whether there's any concerns that come out of that with the leaseholders in those blocks where you're doing works to the tenanted properties.
Brilliant, thank you both. Paul, this one might be for yourself. So why is there a difference between the England and Wales legislation?
Just before you say it, I realised. It's a good question, and not one we can specifically answer really. It's the same across all regions of the UK: Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and Wales. Everyone seems to have their own ideas on what's best. We do hold Scotland up as the standard, as a standard bearer for fire safety. They've made it mandatory across the board, and we can generally see that seems to be the path most of the nations are taking, but some nations are taking longer. But yeah, we also advocate that basically that all nations should be following the same standards. We've got national contractors working in Scotland, working in Wales, and working in England, and working to three entirely different standards. And how that can be better is beyond me, to be honest. But unfortunately, the devolved governments have their own opinion on these things, and in a lot of cases, the Welsh and Scottish, Northern Irish can move a little bit quicker, but just by the very nature of how good things are set up. So I think wherever possible, we are pushing for a unified approach for fire safety and for CO safety, and we will be continuing to this as we move forward as well.
Lovely, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Will the fine for breaching the regulations be per property?
I think that'll be an interesting one for Meadow and Katie and Catherine to answer.
I don't know the answer to that. Is that, Meadow, do you know whether it is a flat rate fine per property, or is it for just generally for poor performance overall?
So I think it applies in the context of a remediation notice. The local authority has the power to essentially serve a remediation notice on a particular landlord who is considered to be in breach, and failure to comply with that remediation notice will then elicit fines. But I think as to the context of what can be included in a particular remediation notice, I think that's yet to be confirmed. And I think also in consequence whether that fine will then extend to multiple properties or just the one is yet to be confirmed. So short answer is don't know yet.
No problem, that's fine. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions. Just wanted to thank you guys for participating in that. I'll now hand over to Giles, who will just close the session. And yeah, thanks for your time again.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you very much to the presenters for all the information that you provided. It's been fantastic. There's some questions that have come through that we need to pick up on, some late questions. Those will be done outside in a separate email. Should anybody have any technical issues or missed any of the presentation, we will be sending out a link because it's been recorded, so you'll be able to see us all again. Thank you very much for your time and have a great day. Thank you.